October 17th, 1868. Silver Creek, Montana Territory. The pen scratched across 15 sheets of foreclosure notices, each stroke as deliberate as a judge's gavel. Nathaniel Blackwood didn't look at the names. He never did. Names had faces, and faces had stories, and stories made the mathematics messy. 17 cents, he muttered, signing the last document. His handwriting was clean, efficient, devoid of flourish. N. Blackwood, CEO. The ink dried quickly in the autumn air filtering through his office window at Silver Creek Bank. Martin Wells, the branch manager, stood by the door like a man waiting for permission to speak. At 50 years old, Wells had seen enough foreclosures to know when mercy might bend the rules. Today wasn't that day. Sir, these families, some of them have circumstances that might warrant. Nathaniel's hand rose, silencing him without a word. He finally looked up from the paperwork, his gray-blue eyes as cold as the Montana winter that would arrive in 3 weeks. Mr. Wells, I pay you to manage a bank, not to run a charity. Sentiment doesn't pay dividends. Numbers do. Wells swallowed whatever objection had formed in his throat. He'd worked for Blackwood for 6 years, long enough to know that arguing with mathematics was like arguing with gravity. You could protest all you wanted, but the world would continue turning on its axis. Nathaniel stood, moving to the window that overlooked Silver Creek's main street. His reflection in the glass showed a man of 35 who looked older around the eyes. Expensive vest, polished boots, the bearing of someone who'd built an empire from creek mud and determination. Behind him, Wells shuffled papers nervously. This bank holds $67,000 in assets, Nathaniel said, his voice flat as arithmetic. 45,000 of that is outstanding loans. If 20% of those loans default, our capital ratio drops below 30%. Below 30%, we're insolvent. Simple math, Mr. Wells, simple math. Wells nodded, accepting the ledger book that would seal 15 families' fates. As he turned to leave, Nathaniel's voice stopped him. The Hartwell account. William Hartwell, Boston, $800, 8 months overdue. The borrower deceased April of this year. Tuberculosis, left behind a widow and 2 children. Yes, sir, I have the foreclosure order ready. Execute it, seize the property, auction the contents, no exceptions. Wells hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded, in that moment, like a cell door locking. Nathaniel remained at the window long after Wells departed. Somewhere in that stack of papers, a woman named Eleanor Hartwell had just lost everything. But Nathaniel didn't know that name yet. Didn't know that in 3 weeks, she would stand before him with 17 cents to her name and change his life forever. All he knew right now was that the mathematics balanced. And in his world, that was the only truth that mattered. The ride back to Blackwood Ranch took 40 minutes, long enough for the October sun to begin its descent behind the Rockies. Nathaniel's horse, a gray gelding named Judge, knew the route by heart. 7 miles of dirt road that wound through scrub pine and limestone outcroppings, ending at the gates of what locals called the fortress. They weren't wrong. The ranch house rose from the valley floor like a cathedral to self-sufficiency. 2 stories of cut granite, red tile roof imported from California at considerable expense. 8 rooms that echoed with emptiness. Behind it stretched 600 acres of grazing land, home to 200 head of prime Angus cattle worth $30 each. The horse barn housed 20 thoroughbreds. The workshop, smokehouse, and granary formed a triangle of industrial efficiency. Water rights to the best creek in the county. Estimated total value, $38,000. Add the $45,000 in his safe upstairs. Add his 60% stake in Silver Creek Bank. Total net worth, $95,000. Nathaniel Blackwood was, by any measure, the richest man within 100 miles, and he lived like a monk. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. No curtains softened the windows. No rugs muffled his footsteps on the stone floor. The furniture was functional to the point of austerity. A table, 4 chairs, a desk, a bed upstairs. The only indulgence was the Steinway piano in the parlor, covered with a canvas tarp, untouched for 8 years. He cooked his own supper: salt pork, hard bread, coffee black enough to strip paint. Ate alone at one end of the 12-foot dining table, washed his own dishes in water hauled from the pump. By 7 o'clock, he was sitting by the fireplace with a glass of whiskey, staring at the flames with the expression of a man who'd forgotten how to see beauty in anything. Above the mantel hung the only photograph in the entire house. Nathaniel at 25, standing beside Margaret Ashford. She wore a dress that cost more than most men earned in a year, her smile bright as July sunshine. Behind them, the ranch house stood half-finished, raw granite walls reaching toward an optimistic sky. The frame bore an engraved inscription, Future Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, 1858. 10 years ago, Nathaniel had believed he had everything, a productive gold claim that had yielded $15,000 in 3 years, a bank that was growing faster than weeds after rain. And Margaret Ashford, daughter of a territorial judge, the most beautiful woman in Montana, who'd agreed to marry him. He'd been a fool. Margaret had left him 6 weeks before the wedding, not with tears or apologies, but with a letter delivered by her father's clerk. She was marrying Senator Harrison of California instead. A man with old money, political connections, a mansion in San Francisco. A man who understood that wealth wasn't just about having money, but about knowing how to spend it, how to live it, how to be part of a world that Nathaniel, for all his gold dust and cattle, would never truly enter. The letter had been polite, even kind in its way. She hoped he'd understand. She wished him well. She was sure he'd find someone more suitable to his temperament. That was the word that had burned into him like a brand. Temperament. As if loving her had been a personality flaw he might outgrow. Nathaniel drained his whiskey, refilled the glass, drained it again. The fire crackled. The house creaked. Somewhere outside, an owl called to the darkness. He sat there until midnight, alone with his $95,000 and his memories, and went to bed in a room as cold as a crypt. He had no way of knowing that 300 miles to the east, a woman with 2 children and 17 cents was climbing onto a stagecoach, heading west with nothing but desperation and a foreclosure notice signed with his name. The mathematics of fate were about to balance themselves in ways that no ledger could predict. Martha Thornton had run the general store in Silver Creek for 23 years. In that time, she'd developed an eye for desperation. It had a look, shoulders too square, trying to compensate for fear. Eyes that scanned prices before touching merchandise. Hands that clutched coins like they were made of light instead of copper. The woman who walked into her store on October 20th had all three. "Good morning," Martha said, her voice deliberately gentle. "You must be new to Silver Creek." The woman turned, and Martha's trained eye took inventory. 28, maybe 30 years old. Good bones, handsome rather than pretty. Dress that had been quality once but was now more patch than original fabric. 2 children behind her, a boy of 11 and a girl of 6, both trying to look brave and failing. "I am," the woman said. Her voice was steady, but Martha heard the exhaustion underneath. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell, from Boston." Martha's hand froze halfway to the coffee tin. Hartwell, William Hartwell, the bank clerk whose widow Blackwood had foreclosed on 6 months ago. The gossip had reached Silver Creek 3 weeks back, traveling faster than any stagecoach. "Mrs. Hartwell," Martha said carefully, "I'm Martha Thornton. I heard about your husband. I'm truly sorry." Eleanor's face didn't change, but something tightened around her eyes. "You heard about the foreclosure too, I imagine." Small town, big ears. Martha set down the coffee tin. "Can I ask what brings you 2,000 miles west?" "Hope," Eleanor said simply. "Or desperation, depending on how you measure it." The boy stepped forward, his young face trying for adult dignity. "Mama, should I get the supplies?" "Not yet, Thomas." Eleanor turned back to Martha. "I have a question, Mrs. Thornton. The man who signed my foreclosure notice, Nathaniel Blackwood, does he live in Silver Creek?" Martha's stomach dropped. "He does. Owns the bank. Runs the biggest ranch in the territory. Why do you ask?" Eleanor reached into her worn carpet bag and produced a document. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, but the signature at the bottom was clear. "N. Blackwood, IEO, because I intend to speak with him. Today if possible." Martha had seen a lot in her years behind the counter, but this was new. Women who'd been foreclosed on usually ran from the men who'd done it. They didn't travel 2,000 miles to find them. Mrs. Hartwell, I should tell you, Mr. Blackwood is not an easy man. I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for fair. He doesn't do charity. I'm not asking for charity. Eleanor's voice was iron-wrapped in silk. I'm asking for work, to pay what my husband owed, every cent. Martha stared at her. The mathematics didn't make sense. $800 at standard wages would take years to repay. But something in Eleanor Hartwell's eyes said she'd already done that math and decided the numbers didn't matter. Mr. Blackwood comes into town every Thursday, Martha said slowly, for supplies. He should be here within the hour. Then I'll wait. Eleanor didn't ask permission. She simply moved to a chair by the window, her children flanking her like small soldiers. Thomas sat with his back straight, his hands folded. Rose, the 6-year-old, clutched a rag doll with stuffing leaking from one arm. Martha went back to her work, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. She'd known Nathaniel Blackwood for a decade, watched him build his empire with ruthless efficiency, seen him turn away every woman in the county who tried to thaw his frozen heart with peace, smiles, or outright proposals. If Eleanor Hartwell thought she could change him with a simple request for work, she was either the bravest woman Martha had ever met or the most foolish. Maybe both. An hour later, the sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground announced his arrival. Martha saw Eleanor's spine straighten, saw her take a deep breath like a soldier preparing for battle. Nathaniel Blackwood climbed down from his wagon with the economy of movement that marked everything he did. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. At 35, he was built like a man who'd spent his youth swinging pickaxes and gold claims. Broad through the shoulders, powerful in the hands. His face was weathered but not old, handsome in the way of functional things. Dark hair showed beneath a battered Stetson. His eyes, even from this distance, were chips of winter's sky. He started toward the store, and Eleanor stepped into his path. Nathaniel Blackwood? He stopped, didn't step back, didn't move around her, just stopped and waited, like she was an obstacle that would remove itself if he was patient enough. I don't take unscheduled appointments. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. My husband was William Hartwell. You signed the foreclosure on our home 6 months ago. The name meant nothing to him at first. Martha could see it in his face. Then something clicked, some memory of a signature on one of 15 documents. William Hartwell, $800, 8 months overdue. You've come here to complain? No, Eleanor said, and her voice could have cut glass. I've come here to work. Now she had his attention. He looked at her fully for the first time, really seeing her. Work? You think I owe you something? You don't owe me anything, but I owe you $800, my husband's debt. I intend to pay it. Nathaniel's expression shifted from annoyance to something that might have been surprise, though it was hard to tell through his habitual frost. You don't understand. That debt was settled when we foreclosed. Legally, you owe nothing. Legally, no. Eleanor took a step closer. But honor doesn't recognize legal loopholes. My husband borrowed that money. My husband couldn't repay it. His honor is now mine to restore. The word hung in the October air like smoke. Honor. In Nathaniel's experience, people who talked about honor usually wanted something else. Money, status, revenge wrapped in pretty words. But Eleanor Hartwell's eyes held no guile, just fierce, uncompromising determination. $800 at $30 a month for domestic work, he said, his voice flat. 27 months, more than 2 years. You're certain? I have 2 children, Thomas, 11 years old. He knows horses from working at a livery stable in Boston. Rose, 6 years old. She's quiet and obedient. If all 3 of us work, we can repay the debt in 15 months. And if I refuse, then I'll ask someone else. But you'll have missed the chance to prove you're more than a man who counts money, that you understand the value of honor. The words hit him like a physical blow. Martha saw it from inside the store, saw Nathaniel's jaw tighten, saw his hands clench once before deliberately relaxing. Because those words, or something very like them, were what Margaret had said in her goodbye letter. That he knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. That he could count gold but couldn't measure the worth of a human heart. 1 hour, he said abruptly. Jameson's Creek. There's a stand of cottonwoods a mile north of town. We'll discuss terms. Don't be late. He walked past her into the store, leaving Eleanor standing in the street like a general who just won the first battle of a long campaign. Inside, Martha found her voice. Lord have mercy. What did you say to him? Eleanor turned, and for the first time, Martha saw uncertainty flicker across her face. I have no idea if it was the right thing, but it was the only thing I could think of. You mentioned honor. Yes, that's the one word that still means something to him. Martha began pulling supplies from the shelves, moving with purpose. The one thing Margaret Ashford couldn't take when she left. You just challenged him on the only ground where he might still feel like he has something to prove. Eleanor's eyes widened. Who's Margaret Ashford? That, Martha said, wrapping cheese in paper, is a story for another day. Right now, you need to get to Jameson's Creek and convince the most stubborn man in Montana that you're worth believing in. Jameson's Creek ran cold and clear through a stand of cottonwoods that had been old when the first trappers came through 30 years ago. Nathaniel arrived first, his horse tied to a low branch, and stood by the water's edge with his arms crossed. When Eleanor appeared with her children, he gestured for Thomas and Rose to stay back by the trees. This conversation is between adults, he said. Eleanor nodded, positioning herself across from him. They stood like negotiators on a battlefield, the creek running between them as neutral territory. Before we continue, Nathaniel said, I need to know what skills you actually possess. Eleanor produced a handwritten list from her pocket, unfolding it with fingers that showed calluses from hard work. I can cook 3 meals a day. Wash, mend, and sew. I managed inventory for 2 restaurants in Boston after my husband became too ill to work. Basic bookkeeping, income and expenses, inventory control. I read, write, and can do arithmetic up to basic algebra. Nathaniel took the paper, scanning it with the focus of a man evaluating a business investment. Your son? Thomas knows basic horse care from the livery stable. He's never ridden well, but he learns quickly. He's strong for his age and doesn't complain about dirty work. The girl? Rose is too young for heavy labor, but she's quiet, won't cause trouble, and can help with light household tasks. Nathaniel pulled a small leather notebook from his vest pocket, along with a pencil stub. He wrote quickly, his handwriting as precise as his speech. Here's the calculation, he said, turning the notebook so Eleanor could see. Housekeeper and cook combined, $50 per month. Stable hand apprentice, $30 per month. Total, $80 monthly. He drew a line under the numbers. Your debt is $800. Divided by 80 equals 10 months. However, I must provide room and board for 3 people, 3 bedrooms, 3 meals daily, winter clothing, emergency medical care. Estimated cost, $40 per month. Another line. Net wages after expenses, $40 per month. 800 divided by 40 equals 20 months. Eleanor's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. 20 months is nearly 2 years, Mrs. Hartwell. Are you prepared for that commitment? What if we work overtime or take additional tasks outside the basic agreement? Overtime isn't traditional here. People work from dawn to dusk without counting hours. Then pay me based on productivity, not hours. If I save you money by reducing waste, repairing instead of replacing, improving efficiency, I keep 20% of what I save. Nathaniel looked up sharply. You know how to negotiate business terms. I learned from my husband. He was weak with money but strong with people. I learned both sides watching him succeed and fail. For the first time in the conversation, something that might have been respect flickered in Nathaniel's eyes. He returned to his notebook, writing more numbers. Here's my final offer. Eleanor Hartwell, housekeeper and cook, $50 monthly. Thomas Hartwell, stable hand apprentice, $30 monthly. Rose Hartwell, no work requirement, may assist voluntarily. Trial period of 1 month, then reassessment. Debt of $800 to be repaid through wage deduction. Performance bonus of 20% on any documented savings you create. Either party may terminate with 1 week notice. He closed the notebook, meeting her eyes directly. If you agree, we shake hands. No written contract. Because if a man's word isn't trustworthy, his signature isn't either. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Thomas and Rose watched from beneath the cottonwoods, their futures hanging on her decision. Finally, she extended her hand. I agree, but one condition. If you mistreat my children, I leave immediately. Money is not more important than their well-being. Fair enough? Nathaniel's grip was firm, calloused, honest. And if you lie or shirk duty, you're dismissed immediately. Honor requires responsibility. They shook hands like two merchants closing a deal on livestock. No warmth, no sentiment, just the clean mathematics of mutual need. As they walked back toward town, Thomas running ahead to check the wagon, Eleanor finally spoke the question that had been building since that morning. Why did you say yes? You could have refused. You have no obligation to me. Nathaniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer, then almost too soft to hear. Because you're the first person in 10 years who asked what I needed instead of what I wanted. What do you need? I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe working with you will help me remember. The first week passed like a military campaign, all strategy and careful positioning. Nathaniel gave them a tour of the ranch at dawn the next morning, his instructions delivered in the clipped cadence of a general briefing troops. 5:30, wake up. Thomas, you'll work with me in the stables from 6 to 8. Eleanor, breakfast at 7:30. Lunch at noon, dinner at 6. On time, not late. He pointed toward the cattle pens. 200 head of Angus, $30 each. Total value $6,000. If disease hits, we lose everything. Thomas, you'll learn to spot sickness early. The boy stepped forward, his face serious. How do I know if a horse is sick, sir? Observation. A healthy horse has bright eyes, alert ears, clean appetite. A sick horse has dull eyes, drooping ears, won't finish its feed. Small details save livestock. For the next hour, Nathaniel taught Thomas about horse care with the patience of a craftsman training an apprentice. 8 pounds of oats daily, 12 pounds of hay, fresh water always available. Muck the stalls twice daily, change bedding weekly. Check hooves for cracks, teeth for age, manure for consistency. Thomas absorbed it all like paper soaking up ink. For the first time since his father's death, someone was teaching him practical skills, treating him like a man in training rather than a child to be pitied. Eleanor watched from the house, recognizing in Nathaniel something she hadn't expected. Loneliness so deep it had calcified into routine. He moved through his domain with absolute competence and zero joy, like a monk performing rituals he no longer believed in. That evening, she prepared the first dinner. Beefsteak, roasted potatoes, fresh bread from the stores Martha had sent. She set the table for 4, a presumption that made her hands shake slightly. When Nathaniel came in at 6 o'clock exactly, he stopped in the doorway, stared at the 4 place settings like they were written in a foreign language. I eat alone, he said, not anymore. Eleanor's voice was gentle but immovable. The agreement was room and board. Board means meals. Meals mean together. He wanted to argue. She could see it in the tension of his jaw, the way his hands opened and closed at his sides. But he'd made an agreement, and agreements were sacred to him in a way that human connection was not. He sat at the head of the table. Eleanor took the opposite end. Thomas and Rose flanked them like small ambassadors at a peace negotiation. They ate in silence for 10 minutes. Then Rose, who'd been staring at the bare walls with 6-year-old confusion, spoke up. Mr. Blackwood, why don't you have pictures on your walls? Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Pictures are for remembering. I prefer not to remember. Remember what? Things that are gone. Rose considered this with the seriousness children bring to adult pain. Mama says we should remember Papa, because forgetting is like losing him twice. The silence that followed was so complete that the tick of the kitchen clock sounded like hammer blows. Nathaniel set down his fork carefully, precisely, like he was defusing a bomb. Your mother is wiser than I am, he said finally. His voice was rough, unused to this kind of honesty. I chose to forget because remembering hurt. But perhaps she's right. Perhaps forgetting is the greater loss. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed, Eleanor found Nathaniel on the porch. He stood with his back to the door, hands gripped on the railing, staring out at the darkness where his empire lay invisible but present. Tomorrow, he said without turning, we begin the real work. I'll teach your son about economics, about the difference between earning money and building wealth, about why mathematics matters more than sentiment. And what will you teach me? Now he turned, and in the lamplight, spilling from the house, his face looked younger, almost vulnerable. I don't know yet. Maybe you'll teach me something instead. Like what? Like why a woman with 17 cents and 2 children would travel 2,000 miles to repay a debt that legally doesn't exist. Like what kind of honor drives someone to choose the hardest path when easier ones are available. Eleanor smiled, and it transformed her face from handsome to beautiful. That's not honor, Mr. Blackwood. That's just stubbornness dressed in better clothes. Then we're well matched, he said. And for the first time since Margaret Ashford had walked out of his life, Nathaniel Blackwood almost laughed. Inside the house, Rose had left something on the kitchen table. A drawing made with charcoal on the back of an old supply list. 4 stick figures standing in front of a square that was obviously meant to be the house. Underneath, in crooked letters, Blackwood family. Nathaniel found it when he came in to bank the fire. He stood there for 5 full minutes, just staring at those 4 crude figures. Then he folded the paper carefully and put it in his vest pocket, right next to his heart. In 3 weeks, Henry Callahan would arrive with an offer that would test every principle Nathaniel held. In 6 weeks, a blizzard would trap them together and force truths neither was ready to speak. In 3 months, he would have to choose between the mathematics he trusted and the people he was learning to love. But tonight, for the first time in a decade, Nathaniel Blackwood went to sleep in a house that felt less like a fortress and more like the beginning of something he'd forgotten how to hope for. A home. November 1st, 1868. 21 days after Eleanor Hartwell arrived at Blackwood Ranch. The first snow came early that year, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Nathaniel stood at his bedroom window at 5 in the morning, watching white flakes drift through the pre-dawn darkness, like ash from a distant fire. By his calculation, if winter arrived this early, it would be brutal. Supplies that should have lasted until March would be gone by February. Cattle would need supplemental feed. The mathematics of survival just got harder. Downstairs, he could already hear Eleanor moving in the kitchen. The woman rose before the sun every morning, as if sleep were a luxury she'd forgotten how to afford. The smell of coffee drifted up through the floorboards, rich and dark and somehow comforting, in a way Nathaniel hadn't experienced since childhood. He dressed quickly, efficiently, and descended to find Thomas already at the kitchen table. The boy had a ledger open in front of him, carefully copying numbers from Nathaniel's master book to a practice sheet. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, a detail that reminded Nathaniel of himself at that age, bent over his first accounting lessons by lamplight in a mining camp. "Good morning, sir," Thomas said without looking up. "I'm working on last month's feed expenses like you showed me." Nathaniel poured coffee, examined the boy's work. The columns were straight, the addition correct, the subtraction showing a clear understanding of cash flow. "You've got the numbers right. Now tell me what they mean." Thomas looked up, his young face serious. "We spent $240 on feed in October. That's $40 more than September. But October has fewer daylight hours, so the cattle eat more to stay warm. The expense will keep rising until March. And we need to account for that in our cash reserves. If we don't, we'll run short in February when we can't buy more feed because the roads are snowed in." Nathaniel nodded, something warm moving in his chest. "Exactly. Most ranchers go bankrupt in February because they don't plan for October. You're thinking like a businessman, Thomas, not just a worker." The boy's face lit up like someone had struck a match in a dark room. Eleanor, turning pancakes at the stove, caught Nathaniel's eye and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." He looked away quickly, uncomfortable with gratitude. He was just teaching mathematics, just sharing information. It wasn't kindness, merely efficiency. At least that's what he told himself. After breakfast, Nathaniel called Thomas into his office, a room the boy had never entered before. The space was Spartan, like the rest of the house. A desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets made from oak. But what caught Thomas's attention was the safe in the corner, a massive iron box with a combination lock. "Sit down," Nathaniel said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger, worn soft from years of handling. "This is the first accounting book I ever kept. 1853, when I was 20 years old. Read the first page. Thomas opened it carefully as if handling scripture. The entries were written in younger, less confident handwriting. January 1853, earned $3 from gold panning. Expenses, $2 for food, 50 cents for tool rental. Net profit, 50 cents. You only made 50 cents your first month? Thomas looked up, surprised. 50 cents, and that was a good month. Some months I lost money. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. But here's the lesson, Thomas. I didn't become wealthy by earning more than everyone else. I became wealthy by saving more and investing smarter. He turned to another page, one filled with more complex calculations. Look at this, June 1854. I'd saved $20. Most miners would have spent it on whiskey and card games. But I saw an opportunity. A claim owner was selling out cheap because his wife was sick and he needed cash immediately. The claim was worth at least $200, maybe more, but he was asking $40. I bought it with my $20 saved plus $20 borrowed from a tool merchant. Did the claim pay out? $300 in the first month. I repaid my loan, kept the claim, worked it for another year. Total yield, $2,000. That's when I learned the real secret of wealth. What's that? Capital compounds. Money makes money, but only if you're patient and strategic. Nathaniel pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, began writing numbers. Let me show you something called the Rule of 72. If you invest money at a fixed interest rate, you can calculate how long it takes to double by dividing 72 by that rate. He wrote 72, 8 equals 9 years. At 8% annual return, your money doubles every 9 years. So if you invest $100 at age 20, by age 29, you have 200. By 38, 400. By 47, 800. By 56, 1,600. You never added a penny after that initial 100, but over 36 years, it grew 16-fold. Thomas's eyes widened. Just from waiting? From patience, from understanding that time is as valuable as money. Nathaniel leaned forward. Most people think rich men are rich because they earn a lot. That's wrong. Rich men are rich because they understand how money works. They make it work for them instead of working for it. Is that how you got so wealthy, investing? Partly, I also diversified. Never put all your resources in one place. I have the ranch, which represents about 60% of my total assets. I own 60% of Silver Creek Bank, and my bank holdings represent another 30% of my wealth. The remaining 10% I keep in cash and gold for emergencies. He paused. Or at least I did. What changed? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, weighing how much truth to share with an 11-year-old. Finally, he said, I committed $45,000 to a fight that might bankrupt me, because sometimes the mathematics of money conflict with the mathematics of honor. When that happens, you have to choose which equation matters more. Thomas absorbed this, his young face thoughtful. My father chose honor over money. That's why we ended up in debt. Your father chose sentiment over sense. There's a difference between honor and foolishness. Honor is keeping your word even when it costs you. Foolishness is making promises you can't keep in the first place. Nathaniel met the boy's eyes. Your father wasn't foolish, Thomas. He was optimistic. He believed things would work out because he wanted them to. That's not the same as being stupid, it's just being human. But it killed him. The debt, the stress, the sickness. The tuberculosis killed him. The debt just made dying harder. Nathaniel stood, moved to the window. Outside, snow was falling harder now, the world turning white. But I won't let that happen to your mother. Or to you. That's why I'm teaching you this. So you'll know the difference between smart risks and stupid ones. Between honor that builds and sentiment that destroys. Thomas came to stand beside him, this boy who'd grown 3 inches in 3 weeks from good food and hard work. Thank you, sir, for teaching me, for not treating me like a child. You stopped being a child when your father died. I'm just helping you become the man you already decided to be. They stood together in silence, watching snow fall, teacher and student connected by something deeper than employment or obligation, something that felt almost like kinship. After lunch, as the storm intensified, Nathaniel heard shouting from the stable. He ran out with Eleanor close behind to find Thomas standing over the bay mare, his face pale with fear. "She won't stand up," the boy said, his voice cracking. "I tried everything you taught me, but she just lies there and won't get up." Nathaniel dropped to his knees beside the horse. The mare's sides were distended, her breathing labored, eyes rolling white with pain. He'd seen this before. Colic, intestinal blockage that could kill a horse in 6 hours if not treated aggressively. "Eleanor, I need boiling water, clean rags, my medical kit from the tack room, and strong coffee. We're going to be here a while." "What can I do?" Thomas asked, his hands shaking. "Everything." Nathaniel gripped the boy's shoulders. "This mare is worth $150. More importantly, she's my best breeding stock. If we lose her, we lose 5 years of genetic development. So we're not going to lose her, understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. First rule of treating colic. Keep the horse moving. If she stays down, her intestines twist. Twisted intestines mean death within hours. So we walk her, for as long as it takes. Hours if necessary." "I can do that." "I know you can, but here's what I need you to understand, Thomas. This is going to be hard, harder than anything you've done before. Your legs will ache. Your arms will feel like they're going to fall off. You'll want to quit. And you can't, because the moment you stop, she stops. And if she stops, she dies. Can you handle that?" Thomas looked at the mare, then back at Nathaniel. "She's counting on me?" "We all are." The boy's jaw set with determination that looked decades older than 11 years. "Then I won't let her die." For the next 8 hours, Thomas walked that horse in endless circles around the stable. Nathaniel administered medicine, a mixture of mineral oil, whiskey, and willow bark extract that he'd learned from an old veterinarian in his mining days. Eleanor brought supplies, blankets, hot food that no one ate. But the real work was Thomas's. "Come on, girl," the boy murmured, his voice constant, soothing. "Just a few more steps. That's it. You're strong. You can do this. Don't give up on me. Please don't give up." By 3 o'clock, Thomas was staggering. By 5, his legs were shaking so badly he could barely walk. But he didn't stop, didn't ask for rest. When the mare tried to lie down, he pulled on her lead rope with strength he shouldn't have had, sheer willpower keeping both of them upright. Nathaniel watched from the stable entrance, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. Pride, maybe, or recognition of something in Thomas that reminded him of himself at that age, when he'd worked 18-hour days in gold claims because stopping meant starving. At 6 o'clock, the mare suddenly perked her ears, turned toward the feed bucket, took a small, tentative bite of hay. "She's eating," Eleanor whispered from beside Nathaniel. "Does that mean—" "She's going to live." Nathaniel's voice was rough. "The blockage has passed. She's going to live." Thomas looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt and exhaustion. "Really? She's really going to be okay? You saved her, son. Not me. You." The word hung in the air between them. Son. Nathaniel hadn't meant to say it. It had slipped out, unbidden, from some part of him that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Thomas's face crumpled, all the fear and exhaustion he had been holding back for 8 hours finally breaking through. His legs gave out. Nathaniel caught him, held him while he sobbed. This child who'd lost his father and his home and every certainty he'd ever known, who'd just spent 8 hours refusing to let something else die on his watch. "I couldn't let her die," Thomas whispered into Nathaniel's shoulder. "I couldn't. Not when I could do something about it. Not when someone was counting on me." "I know." Nathaniel's own eyes burned. "That's what makes you strong, Thomas. Not that you don't feel afraid or tired or overwhelmed, but that you don't let those feelings stop you from doing what needs to be done." Eleanor appeared in the stable doorway, her face showing she'd heard everything. She didn't interrupt, just stood witness to this moment of two broken people finding something whole in each other. When Nathaniel finally looked up and met her eyes, she was crying too. Not from sadness, but from something else. Hope, maybe. Or recognition that the walls Nathaniel had built so carefully were finally beginning to crumble. That evening, after Thomas had been put to bed and Rose was asleep, Nathaniel found Eleanor on the porch again. She stood wrapped in a blanket against the cold, watching snow continue to fall. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Already there was 6 inches on the ground, and the temperature was dropping fast. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked down at her hands, surprised. The hot water and rough rags had opened old cuts from previous work. "I hadn't noticed." "Come inside. I'll wrap them." In the kitchen by lamplight, Nathaniel cleaned and bandaged Eleanor's hands with the same careful attention he'd given the mare. His hands were gentle, his focus absolute. When he finished, he didn't immediately let go. "Your husband," he said quietly. "What was he like?" Eleanor's breath caught. In 3 weeks, he'd never asked about William. Never acknowledged that she'd had a life before arriving here with 17 cents and 2 desperate children. "He was kind," she said finally. "Parable with money, brilliant with people. He could convince anyone of anything because he genuinely believed in human goodness. It made him easy to love and easy to swindle." "Do you miss him?" "Every day. But missing him doesn't help my children. So I do what needs doing and save the missing for nights when they're asleep." "That's practical. That's survival." She met his eyes. "Why are you asking about him now?" "Because I need to know if you're here because you have nowhere else to go or because you're choosing to be here. There's a difference." Eleanor turned her hands over, looking at the fresh bandages. His work was neat, precise, the knots tied with the efficiency of someone who'd bandaged many wounds. 3 weeks ago, I would have said the first. I was desperate. You were available. It was transaction, pure and simple. And now? Now I'm still desperate, but it's a different kind. Now I'm desperate to see Thomas learn what you're teaching him. Desperate to give Rose a stable home long enough that she forgets what it's like to go to sleep hungry. Desperate to prove that I can be more than a widow living on someone else's charity. She looked up at him. "So yes, I'm choosing to be here. Not because I have no options, but because this option matters." Does that answer your question? It does. They sat in silence for a long moment, the lamp flickering between them, the house settling around them with the comfortable creaks of a structure built to last. Outside, the wind howled, but inside it was warm, safe, something neither of them had felt in years. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said, using his first name for the first time. "What happened with Margaret? Everyone knows she left, but no one knows why." His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he stood, walked to the cabinet above the stove, and pulled down a letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the folds worn soft from being opened and reread too many times. "Read it," he said, handing it to her. "Everyone else knows the story secondhand. You might as well hear it from the source." Eleanor unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the penmanship of someone who'd never done manual labor. "Dear Nathaniel, I hope this letter finds you well, though I suspect it will find you angry. I'm writing from San Francisco, where I'm now Mrs. Harrison, wife to Senator Charles Harrison. I won't insult you with excuses, so I'll be honest instead. I left because I was afraid. Afraid of the isolation, the endless winters, the hard work that would ruin my hands and age me before my time. You offered me comfort, security, a well-built house, but you couldn't offer me society, culture, a world beyond fence posts and cattle. I need more than that to be happy. I know you think I'm shallow, choosing wealth over love. Perhaps I am, but I'd rather be shallow in a mansion than noble in a fortress. I hope you find someone better suited to your temperament, someone who can love the land as much as you do, someone who can see value in what you've built instead of mourning what you haven't. Margaret." Eleanor refolded the letter, her hands shaking slightly with anger. She was a fool. She was honest, that's more than most people manage. Honest, yes, but foolish. She chose easy over meaningful, comfort over connection, status over substance. Eleanor stood, faced him directly. "You built something remarkable here, Nathaniel. Not just a ranch, but a life, a legacy." She couldn't see that because she was too busy counting what you didn't have instead of recognizing what you did. "Maybe I didn't have enough." "No, you had more than enough. You just offered it to someone who couldn't recognize value when it wore work boots instead of dress shoes." She paused. "Do you still love her?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't know. I loved who I thought she was, but that person never existed. She was always someone else, playing a role she thought I wanted to see. When she left, I realized I'd been in love with a fiction. That's worse than betrayal. At least betrayal is real. Yes. He took the letter back, stared at it like he was seeing it for the first time. I kept this as a reminder that sentiment is dangerous, that trusting people leads to disappointment, that numbers are safer than hearts because numbers don't lie. And has that philosophy made you happy? It's made me successful. That's not the same thing. He looked at her, really looked, and Eleanor saw something shift behind his eyes, a crack in the armor he'd worn for a decade. No, he admitted, it's not. Before either could say more, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Nathaniel checked his pocket watch, 9:15, too late for social calls. He opened the door to find Pete Lawson standing in the snow, his horse behind him, steaming in the cold. The older man's face was grim. Callahan knows about our coalition, Pete said without preamble, stepping inside and stamping snow from his boots. He's already moving to counter us. Bought out Jim Henderson and Jake Morrison this afternoon, paid them $200,000 combined, and he's spreading rumors throughout the territory that we're blocking progress, that we're going to cost Montana thousands of jobs and millions in economic development. Public opinion warfare, Nathaniel said, his mind already shifting into strategic mode. Smart. If he can turn the community against us, judges will be more likely to rule in his favor regardless of legal merit. There's more. Pete's voice dropped even lower. As of today, Callahan purchased controlling interest in the Silver Creek Feed Company. Starting tomorrow, feed prices for coalition members triple. Everyone else pays standard rates. Eleanor stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. He can't do that. That's extortion. It's business, Pete corrected bitterly. Perfectly legal. He owns the company. He sets the prices. If we don't like it, we can buy feed elsewhere. Except the next closest supplier is 40 miles away in Helena, and with winter coming and roads getting worse, we can't guarantee regular deliveries. Nathaniel's mind was already calculating. Triple feed prices meant an additional $400 monthly expense. With zero cash reserves after funding the coalition, he'd be completely bankrupt by January. The other ranchers with smaller operations and tighter margins would fare even worse. How many of us are left, he asked. You, me, and Brennan, that's it. Morrison and Henderson broke because they couldn't face the feed costs. They've got bigger herds than us, needed the money more urgently. Pete slumped into a chair, looking defeated. Blackwood, maybe we should accept reality. Callahan has more money, more connections, more leverage. Maybe fighting him is just throwing good money after bad. No. The word came out harder than Nathaniel intended. He forced himself to speak more calmly. No, we don't surrender. Don't. Not yet. Then what do? We can't match his financial resources. We can't lobby judges and politicians the way he can. We're three ranchers against a railroad empire. We don't fight with money. We fight with strategy. Nathaniel turned to Eleanor. You said your husband was good with people. Did he teach you anything about public relations? About changing narratives? She thought for a moment, then smiled slowly, dangerously. He taught me that people don't buy products. They buy stories. And right now, Callahan is selling the wrong story. Which is? That we're obstacles to progress. Selfish ranchers standing in the way of jobs and prosperity in the future. Eleanor moved to the table, began sketching on a piece of paper with quick, confident strokes. But what if we change the narrative? What if instead of being obstacles, we're protectors? Protecting not just our land, but the water supply for every rancher in the territory. Protecting traditional ways of life against corporate overreach. Protecting small businessmen against railroad monopolies that will control them all once we're eliminated. Pete leaned over her shoulder, watching her write out talking points with the precision of someone who'd done this before. That's good. That's really good. But how do we spread that story? Callahan owns the territorial newspaper. He can print whatever version of events he wants. We don't use newspapers. We use something more powerful, people. Eleanor looked up at both men. Town meetings, church services, the general store, anywhere people gather to talk. We tell our story directly. Make it personal. Put faces and names and families on what Callahan is trying to take. That could work, Pete said slowly. Martha Thornton at the general store has been sympathetic. And Reverend Harwell at the church doesn't like Callahan much after he tried to buy church land for speculation. Then we start there. Eleanor's pen moved faster now, sketching out a communication plan. Pete, you organize town meetings. Get as many people as possible. Nathaniel handles the legal arguments, the property rights issues, the technical details. I'll prepare the personal stories, the emotional appeals that make people care. What about Brennan? Pete asked. Brennan has the best water rights in the county after Nathaniel. He can speak about what happens when one entity controls all water access. Make it real for farmers who depend on that resource. For the next 2 hours, they plan. Pete would organize the first town meeting for next week, right after Sunday services when the most people would be available. Eleanor wrote out talking points, stories that transformed abstract legal concepts into human terms. Nathaniel drafted the technical arguments about water rights, property law, and railroad monopoly dangers. By midnight, when Pete finally left, they had a plan. Not a guarantee of success, but a fighting chance. And for men and women who'd been backed into a corner, a fighting chance was all they needed. Eleanor started cleaning up the papers scattered across the table. Nathaniel stopped her with a hand on her arm. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For being here. For thinking like a partner instead of an employee. For seeing possibilities where I only saw problems. For knowing how to fight battles I don't understand. She covered his hand with hers just for a moment. The touch was brief, professional, but something passed between them. An acknowledgement of connection that went deeper than business arrangement, or survival necessity. That's what partners do, she said. They fill in each other's gaps. You understand numbers and law and strategy. I understand people and stories and persuasion. Together, we're stronger than either of us alone. What are my gaps? Nathaniel asked, surprising himself with the vulnerability of the question. Eleanor smiled. You think too much and feel too little. You trust numbers, but not people. You can calculate risk, but struggle with hope. You see the world in transactions instead of relationships. Her smile softened. But you're learning. Slowly, but learning. And what are your gaps? I feel too much and think too little sometimes. I trust people when I should trust numbers. I can imagine possibilities but struggle with practical execution. I see relationships but miss transactions until they bite me. She squeezed his hand once before withdrawing. But I'm learning too. They stood there in the lamplight, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. Not romance exactly, something different. Partnership built on mutual respect and complementary skills and the slow recognition that they might be stronger together than apart. Eleanor, Nathaniel said as she turned to go, when this is over, when we've beaten Callahan and survived the winter, there's something I need to ask you. But not now, not when everything is uncertain and the outcome is unclear. What is it? Ask me again when spring comes. If we're both still here, if we've survived what's coming, I'll tell you. I'll ask you properly. She nodded, understanding that some questions couldn't be rushed. Some decisions required time and proof and the solid ground of certainty. Then I'll see you in the spring, Nathaniel Blackwood. See you in the spring, Eleanor Hartwell. She climbed the stairs to check on her sleeping children. He stayed in the kitchen, banking the fire, putting the house to bed with the careful attention he brought to everything. When he finally went upstairs, he paused outside Eleanor's door, heard her soft voice reading to Rose, who'd apparently woken from a nightmare. And the brave knight faced the dragon, Eleanor was saying, not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you keep going even when you are scared. Was Papa brave? Rose asked in her small voice. Papa was very brave. He fought an invisible dragon called sickness for a long time. And even though the dragon won in the end, Papa never stopped fighting, never stopped protecting us. That's the bravest thing anyone can do. Is Mr. Blackwood brave too? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Yes, sweetheart, in different ways. Mr. Blackwood fights dragons called loneliness and fear and memories that hurt, and he's learning to win those fights, just like we are. Nathaniel moved away from the door before they could hear him, but Eleanor's words followed him to his own room. Dragons called loneliness and fear and memories that hurt. She understood him better than he'd realized. saw past the cold exterior to the wounds beneath. He sat on his bed, looking around the spare room that had been his prison for a decade. Tomorrow he would fight Henry Callahan with words and law and public opinion. Next week there would be another battle, and another after that. Winter would bring more challenges, more crises, more moments when failure seemed inevitable. But tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Blackwood went to sleep in a house that felt less like a fortress and more like the beginning of something he'd forgotten how to hope for. Not just a building with walls and a roof, but something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more fragile. A home, a family, a future that couldn't be calculated in ledgers, but might be worth more than all the gold in Montana. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the world in white, erasing boundaries between past and future, between what was lost and what might still be found. And in that white silence, three people slept under one roof, bound together by mathematics and necessity, and something deeper that none of them were quite ready to name. But spring was coming, and with it, questions that would demand answers, choices that would determine whether they were just survivors sharing space or something more permanent, something that might last beyond winter, beyond crisis, beyond the careful calculations that had governed all their lives until now. The mathematics of the heart, Nathaniel was learning, didn't follow the same rules as the mathematics of money. But somehow, against all logic and probability and reasonable expectation, they balanced just the same. December 8th, 1868, 5 weeks into the coalition's fight against Henry Callahan. The blizzard had cost them dearly. 30 head of cattle lay dead, frozen casualties that represented $1,200 Nathaniel could barely afford to lose. The stable roof still showed patch repairs where snow had collapsed through. But those losses would mean nothing if they lost the fight against Callahan entirely. The town meeting packed Silver Creek's community hall beyond capacity. Nathaniel stood at the back, counting heads out of habit. 87 people, maybe 90. More than he'd expected, more than Callahan would have wanted. Eleanor stood at the front beside Pete Lawson and Robert Brennan, the only coalition members still standing. She wore her best dress, the one she'd been saving, mended so carefully that the patches were nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Her hair was pinned up in a style that made her look older, more authoritative, more like someone people should listen to. Nathaniel had wanted to stand with her. She'd refused. "You're the money man," she'd said that morning. "The brain. Let me be the heart." People trust hearts more than brains when they're scared. She'd been right. She was right about most things involving people, a fact that both impressed and unsettled him. For 10 years, Nathaniel had trusted only mathematics. Now he was learning to trust something less quantifiable, Eleanor Hartwell's instinct for human nature. Pete Lawson called the meeting to order, explained the situation in blunt terms. Callahan wanted their land. The railroad was coming. Eminent domain loomed like a guillotine over all their heads. If the coalition failed, what happened to Blackwood Ranch and the others would happen to every small landowner in the territory eventually. Then Eleanor spoke. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. 8 months ago, I lost my home to foreclosure. My husband had died. I had 2 children, no money and nowhere to go. I know what it feels like when powerful people take everything you've built and leave you with nothing but shame and fear. The room was absolutely silent. People leaned forward, drawn by the raw honesty in her voice. "I came to Montana because I'd heard there was still opportunity here, still a chance for people like me to rebuild, to start over, to prove that hard work and integrity still matter." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. "But I'm learning that opportunity only exists as long as we protect it, as long as we stand together against those who would turn this territory into their private empire. Henry Callahan isn't just trying to build a railroad. He's trying to build a monopoly. Once he controls the land, he'll control the water. Once he controls the water, he'll control every ranch, every farm, every business that depends on it. And then you'll all be exactly where I was 6 months ago, at the mercy of someone who sees you as nothing but numbers in a ledger." Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. Those last words were aimed at him as much as Callahan. A reminder of who he had been when Eleanor arrived, who he'd be again if he let fear and calculation override conscience. Eleanor continued, "The men standing beside me aren't fighting for themselves. They're fighting for all of you, for the future of this community, for the principle that a man's land is his own, that his water belongs to him, that powerful interests can't simply take what they want because they have more money and better lawyers. She pulled out a paper, unfolded it carefully. This is the foreclosure notice that cost me my home. It was signed by a man who had every legal right to take what my husband owed. But legal doesn't always mean right, just doesn't always mean fair. Nathaniel stiffened. She was about to reveal his role in her foreclosure, publicly, in front of the entire town. It would destroy any moral authority he had, turn the coalition's stand into hypocrisy. Eleanor met his eyes across the room, held his gaze, then deliberately folded the paper without revealing the signature. "The man who signed this taught me something important," she said. "He taught me that acknowledging mistakes takes more courage than defending them. That true strength isn't never being wrong, but learning to be better when you are. That honor isn't about perfection. It's about choosing right, even when it costs you everything." She turned back to the crowd. That's what Nathaniel Blackwood is doing now, choosing right even though it might cost him everything. He's spent $45,000 of his own money funding legal challenges, engineering surveys, and support for ranchers who can't afford to fight alone. He's refused offers of $300,000 that would have made him one of the richest men in Montana. Why? Not because he's a saint, but because he understands what Callahan doesn't, that some things can't be measured in dollars. Community can't. Integrity can't. The right to build something with your own hands and know it's yours can't be bought or sold or foreclosed. So I'm asking you tonight, stand with us, not because victory is guaranteed, but because fights are worth having, even if we lose. Because the alternative is surrendering without ever raising our voices. Because our children deserve to inherit a Montana where opportunity still exists for everyone, not just the wealthy and well-connected. When she finished, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause that sounded like thunder in the small space. Nathaniel watched Eleanor step back from the podium, saw her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, saw Pete Lawson grip her shoulder in gratitude, saw faces in the crowd that had been skeptical now nodding, convinced, ready to stand against Callahan's machine. She'd done it, changed the narrative, turned them from obstacles into heroes, from selfish ranchers into community defenders, made it personal and moral and bigger than property disputes. After the meeting, as people filed out into the December night, Nathaniel found Eleanor on the hall's front steps. She stood wrapped in a shawl, breathing hard, watching townspeople disperse into the darkness. "You didn't reveal the signature," he said quietly. "No." "Why not? It would have been powerful, showing that even the person who hurt you most is capable of redemption, that you forgave and moved forward." Eleanor turned to him, her face unreadable in the lamplight spilling from the hall. "Because this fight isn't about you and me, Nathaniel. It's bigger than our personal story. Using that would have made it small again, made it about individual redemption instead of collective resistance. You're learning to think beyond transactions," Nathaniel said quietly. "I understand what this fight really represents." She pulled the shawl tighter. "Besides, some stories are private. Not everything needs to be shared with audiences." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Pete Lawson emerged, his weathered face split with a grin Nathaniel hadn't seen in weeks. "Mrs. Hartwell, that was the finest speech I've heard since Lincoln came through on his campaign tour," Pete said. "You've got half the town ready to march on Callahan's office tomorrow. Reverend Harwell wants to organize a letter-writing campaign to the territorial governor. Even old Silas Murphy, who never cares about anything except his whiskey, said he'd testify about Callahan's intimidation tactics if we need witnesses." "Good," Eleanor said simply. "But words only matter if we follow them with action. What's our next move?" "Railroad inspector arrives in 3 days," Nathaniel said. "Marcus Hendricks, chief engineer for Pacific Railroad. He's coming to evaluate both proposed routes, Callahan's direct path through our coalition land and our alternative route that adds 8 miles but avoids the legal complications." "Will he be fair?" Eleanor asked. "Hendricks has a reputation for integrity, but he's also a railroad man. His priority is the cheapest, most efficient route. If our alternative costs significantly more, he'll recommend Callahan's path regardless of legal issues. Then we need to make our route attractive, not just legally, but economically. That's impossible, Pete said. 8 extra miles means 120,000 in additional construction costs. Even if we could somehow subsidize part of that, we don't have the resources. Eleanor's eyes were distant, calculating. What if we didn't subsidize the cost, but reduced it? What if we could prove that our route actually saves money in the long term, despite the extra mileage? How? Nathaniel asked, intrigued despite his skepticism. Maintenance. Callahan's route crosses 2 major creeks with seasonal flooding. Building bridges to handle spring runoff would cost a fortune, and those bridges would need constant maintenance. Our route follows higher ground, avoids the floodplains entirely. Lower upfront infrastructure costs, dramatically lower maintenance over the railroad's lifetime. Nathaniel's mind raced through the calculations. She was right. He'd been so focused on construction costs that he'd missed the operational analysis. Over 30 years, avoiding flood damage and bridge maintenance could save $250,000 or more. That's brilliant, he said, but we need engineering data to prove it. Hydrological surveys, geological reports, cost projections. Jake Morrison was a railroad engineer before he sold out to Callahan, Pete said. He'd have the expertise to produce those reports, but he took Callahan's money. He won't help us now. Maybe he will, Eleanor said quietly, if we ask the right way. The next morning, Eleanor and Nathaniel rode to Jake Morrison's ranch together. The property was smaller than Blackwood's, only 200 acres, but well-maintained. Morrison had used Callahan's money wisely, paying off debts and making improvements he'd deferred for years. Jake met them on his porch, his 40-year-old face showing the guilt of a man who'd chosen survival over solidarity. Blackwood, Mrs. Hartwell, I figured you'd come eventually. We're not here to judge you, Jake, Eleanor said before Nathaniel could speak. You made the choice you had to make for your family. No one faults you for that. Morrison's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then why are you here? Because we need your expertise, Nathaniel said, and because I think part of you regrets taking Callahan's deal. Not because the money was wrong, but because of what it represented. I sold out my neighbors. That's what it represented. You took the only reasonable option available to you at the time, Eleanor corrected. But circumstances have changed. The railroad inspector is coming. If we can prove our alternative route is actually more cost-effective long-term, we have a chance. But we need professional engineering analysis to make that case. You're the only person in the territory with the credentials and knowledge to produce reports that Hendricks will respect. Morrison shook his head. I took Callahan's money. If I help you now, I'm betraying that agreement. He could sue me for breach of contract, take back everything he paid. Could he? Nathaniel pulled out a document. I had my lawyer review your sale agreement. Callahan bought your land and water rights. Nothing in the contract prevents you from consulting it as a private engineer on unrelated projects. The coalition would hire you, pay you standard engineering rates, completely separate from your land sale. Jake took the document, read it carefully. His engineer's mind would spot any flaws or tricks, but there were none. The loophole was real. You'd pay me to work against Callahan after I abandoned the coalition? We'd pay you to do your job, Eleanor said, to provide honest technical analysis. If that analysis shows Callahan's route is actually superior, we'll accept it. But if it shows what we suspect, that our route is more economical long-term, then you'd be doing the railroad a favor by steering them toward the better investment. Morrison was silent for a long time, staring at the contract. Finally, he looked up at Eleanor. Why are you really doing this, Mrs. Hartwell? You don't owe this territory anything. You could take Blackwood's money and run. Start fresh somewhere easier. Why stay and fight? Eleanor's voice was soft but firm. Because running doesn't solve anything. It just moves the problem. I ran from Boston to Pittsburgh to Louis too here, and every place I went, I found the same truth. The world belongs to people brave enough to fight for it. I'm tired of running. My children deserve to see their mother stand her ground. Jake nodded slowly. I'll do it, but I need 3 days for the surveys and reports. And I want it in writing that this is a separate engineering contract, no connection to the land sale. Done, Nathaniel said, extending his hand. Thank you, Jake. They shook hands, and Nathaniel saw something shift in Morrison's face. Relief, maybe. Or redemption. The chance to do right after doing wrong, even if it came with risk. Riding back to Blackwood Ranch, Eleanor was quiet. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, watching snow-covered landscape roll past. Finally, she spoke. You would have approached that differently, wouldn't you? Before I came. I would have led with legal arguments, made it about contracts and obligations, probably would have failed. Why? Because people don't respond to logic when they're drowning in guilt. They respond to being given a way to feel honorable again. You understood that. I didn't. Eleanor smiled. You're learning, Nathaniel Blackwood. Slowly, but learning. 3 days later, Marcus Hendricks arrived on the noon stage. He was a compact man of 45, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked construction before rising to management. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Nathaniel and Pete met him at the hotel, presented both route proposals with professional courtesy. Hendricks reviewed the documents with the careful attention of someone who knew that his recommendation would determine millions in railroad investment. Your alternative route adds 8 miles, Hendricks said, tapping the map. That's significant additional cost. Initial construction estimate is $120,000 more than Callahan's direct path. Why should the railroad pay that premium? Because the direct path crosses the Clearwater Creek floodplain, Nathaniel said. Jake Morrison, former railroad engineer, produced a hydrological analysis showing seasonal flooding requires substantially more expensive bridge infrastructure. Over 30 years of maintenance, the direct route actually costs more despite being shorter. He slid Jake's engineering report across the table. Hendricks read it, his expression neutral, but Nathaniel saw his eyes pause on certain passages, saw the slight nod when he encountered data that confirmed professional truths. Morrison's analysis is solid, Hendricks admitted. The flood risk is real, and bridge maintenance costs would be substantial. But there's another factor. The direct route gives the railroad access to Callahan's land development projects along the corridor. Commercial development means shipping revenue beyond just passenger traffic. That economic multiplier might offset the infrastructure costs. Unless the commercial development is speculative, Eleanor said from the doorway. All 3 men turned. She'd been instructed to stay away from the business meeting, but there she was, carrying a folder that looked official and intimidating. Mrs. Hartwell, Nathaniel said carefully, this is Marcus Hendricks, Pacific Railroad Chief Engineer. Mr. Hendricks, Eleanor Hartwell, my associate. Ma'am, Hendricks stood, clearly uncomfortable with a woman's presence in business negotiations. I apologize for the interruption, Eleanor said smoothly, but I've been researching Callahan's commercial development claims. These are land registry records from the territorial office. Callahan owns 30,000 acres along the proposed direct route. He's been advertising them as future commercial sites to investors. But here's what's interesting. She spread documents across the table. Callahan claims these lands are immediately ready for development. Flat, accessible with good water access. But geological surveys from 1863, when the territory was evaluating land grants, tell a different story. Most of his holdings are on alkaline soil, unsuitable for agriculture or heavy construction. Building commercial structures there would require extensive soil remediation, adding tens of thousands to every project. Hendricks picked up the geological surveys, his face darkening as he read. These are territorial government documents, official records. Yes, which means Callahan's commercial development projections are based on false premises. He's selling investors on land that can't support what he's promising. Which means the railroad's revenue projections from commercial activity are also wrong. Hendricks looked at Eleanor with new respect. How did you uncover this, Mrs. Hartwell? By asking questions, by reading public records, by assuming that a man who'd engage in economic coercion and political manipulation might also engage in fraud. She met his eyes steadily. By doing basic due diligence that apparently no one else bothered with. The engineer turned to Nathaniel. Did you know about this? Not until this morning. Mrs. Hartwell works independently on certain research projects. She has a talent for finding information others miss. That was an understatement. Eleanor had spent 2 weeks at the Territorial Records Office, going through decades of land surveys and geological assessments. She'd connected dots no one else had seen, built a case that transformed Callahan from savvy businessman to potential fraudster. Hendricks gathered the documents. I'll need to verify these with the Territorial Office. If they were accurate, they changed the economic equation significantly. The railroad can't justify the direct route if the commercial development justification is fraudulent. How long will verification take? Pete asked. 3 days. I'll send a telegram to our corporate counsel, have them examine the records independently. Hendricks looked at Nathaniel. If Mrs. Hartwell's findings are confirmed, the railroad will recommend your alternative route. We don't do business with the land speculators engaged in fraud. After Hendricks left, Nathaniel sat in stunned silence. Eleanor had just done in 2 weeks what his lawyers hadn't managed in 2 months, found the weakness that could bring Callahan down. Where did you learn to research like that? He asked. Boston Public Library. When William was sick, I'd spend hours there while he slept, reading legal texts, property law, historical records. I couldn't help him, couldn't change what was happening. So I educated myself, figured knowledge might be useful someday. It was more than useful, it was decisive. Eleanor shrugged. Callahan made a mistake. He assumed no one would question his claims because he's rich and powerful. He forgot that public records are public. Anyone can read them if they're willing to do the work. Most people aren't willing. Most people aren't fighting for their survival. That evening, as they rode back to the ranch, it began to snow. Not the gentle flakes of early winter, but hard, driving snow that stung at Bo's skin and reduced visibility to arm's length. By the time they reached Blackwood Ranch, 3 inches had accumulated and the temperature was dropping fast. Blizzard coming, Nathaniel said, helping Eleanor down from her horse. Real one this time. We need to prepare. For the next 6 hours, they worked frantically. Nathaniel and Thomas secured the livestock, brought extra feed into protected storage, checked every building for structural weaknesses. Eleanor and Rose stockpiled firewood, filled every container with water, prepared food that could last days without fresh cooking. By midnight, when the full fury of the storm hit, they were as ready as possible. The 4 of them gathered in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and waited for morning. The blizzard raged for 3 days. Outside, the world disappeared into white chaos. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature fell to 20 below. Wind screamed around the house with the voice of something alive and malevolent. Inside, they huddled together, rationing lamp oil, keeping the fire burning, telling stories to pass the time. On the second night, Rose woke screaming from a nightmare. Eleanor held her daughter, rocking her gently, but the girl couldn't be consoled. The house is breaking, Rose sobbed. I heard it. The walls are breaking and the snow is coming in, and we're all going to freeze. The house isn't breaking, Nathaniel said, kneeling beside them. It's fighting. Old houses creak and groan in storms because they're strong, not weak. Every sound you hear is the house proving it can handle whatever the weather throws at it. Really? Really. I built this house myself, Rose. I overbuilt it, actually. Made the walls thicker than necessary, the roof stronger than needed, the foundation deeper than typical. Because I knew Montana winters were harsh. This house could handle a storm twice as bad as this one. Rose looked at him with 6-year-old gravity. You built it for Margaret, or didn't you, before she left? The adults froze. The child's innocent perception had struck directly at truth no one had spoken aloud. Yes, Nathaniel said after a long pause. I built it for her, for the family we were supposed to have. But she made a different choice. Was it a good house for her? I thought so, but maybe not. Maybe I built what I thought a house should be instead of what she needed it to be. Is it a good house for us? Nathaniel looked at Eleanor, then back at Rose. Yes, because you understand what this house is for. It's for keeping people safe, for giving them a place to belong, for showing them that walls can be strong without being prison bars. Rose nodded solemnly, satisfied with this answer. She fell back asleep in her mother's arms, comforted by the philosophy of good construction. Later, after the children were in bed, Eleanor found Nathaniel in his office. He sat at his desk, staring at ledgers that told an increasingly grim story. How bad is it? She asked. Financially? Catastrophic. I'm losing $400 a month. My reserves are gone. If I can't generate new income soon, I'll have to start selling assets. Cattle first, then land, then eventually the house itself. Will it come to that? Not if Hendricks recommends our route. The railroad will pay the coalition $60,000 for easement rights. My share would be $20,000, enough to survive until spring. He closed the ledger. But if Hendricks rules against us, if Callahan wins, I'll be bankrupt by February. Eleanor sat across from him. And me, Thomas and Rose, what happens to us if you go bankrupt? The question hung heavy between them. By their original agreement, Eleanor and her children would leave if the arrangement stopped working. Bankruptcy would certainly qualify. I won't let you starve, Nathaniel said. I have assets I can liquidate. I'll give you enough money to get to San Francisco, set up somewhere stable. You've earned that much. That's not what I asked. What are you asking? Eleanor met his eyes directly. I'm asking if you want us to stay, not because of our agreement, not because of economics or obligations, but because you want us here, because we're more than employees or business partners. What are we then? I don't know. That's what I'm asking you to define. Nathaniel stood, walked to the window. Outside, snow continued falling. The world reduced to simple elements, white and black, cold and warm, inside and outside. When Margaret left, he said quietly, I promised myself I'd never care that much again. Never give anyone that power over me. For 10 years, I kept that promise. And for 10 years, I was successful and miserable and completely alone. He turned to face her. Then you arrived with 17 cents and 2 children, demanding the chance to repay a debt that didn't legally exist. And every day since, you've been breaking down the walls I spent a decade building. Not with romance or seduction or the things Margaret used, but with competence and honesty and the simple willingness to stand beside me when standing was hard. Nathaniel, I'm not finished. He crossed to her, knelt so they were eye level. I don't know what we are, Eleanor. I don't have words for it. It's not employment. It's not quite partnership. It's not romance, at least not the kind novels describe. But it's something I need more than success or wealth or the pride of never being hurt again. He took her hands. So yes, I want you to stay. Not because of agreements or survival necessity, but because this house isn't a home without you in it. Because Thomas deserves the father I'm learning to become. Because Rose makes me remember what hope feels like. Because you, he stopped, searching for words adequate to feelings he'd spent 10 years denying existed. Because you make me want to be better than I am, he finished. Because around you, I remember that life is more than ledgers and property lines. That some things can't be quantified. That the most valuable wealth is measured in people, not gold. Eleanor's eyes were wet. That's the most words I've ever heard you speak at once. I'm terrified, he admitted, of failing, of losing you, of building something precious and watching it crumble like everything else I've built. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Nathaniel, but neither does hiding. At some point, you have to choose between protecting yourself and living fully. You can't do both. I know. He took a shaky breath. So I'm choosing. If you'll have me, if you'll stay. On what terms? I don't know. That's terrifying too. We'll figure it out as we go, like we've been doing. Make mistakes and fix them. Build something imperfect but real. Eleanor smiled through her tears. That's the most uncharacteristically uncertain thing I've ever heard you say. Usually you have everything calculated to 3 decimal places. Some equations are too complex for calculation. You taught me that. She leaned forward, rested her forehead against his. Not a kiss exactly. Something different. A moment of connection that acknowledged everything unspoken between them. Promise without pressure. Commitment without coercion. 2 lonely people finding something whole in each other. I'll stay, she whispered. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I'd rather fight beside you than be safe anywhere else. Even if I lose everything, you're not losing everything. You're learning what everything actually means. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the lamplight while the storm raged outside. building something that couldn't be foreclosed or seized or taxed, something that existed only between people who chose each other despite risk and fear and uncertain futures. The blizzard finally broke on the fourth day. Nathaniel and Thomas ventured out to assess damage, finding 30 head of cattle dead, frozen or buried, and the stable roof partially collapsed under snow weight. $1,200 in losses, adding to already catastrophic finances. Martha Thornton brought it to the ranch as soon as roads were passable, her face bright with news she could barely contain. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Hartwell, this came 3 days ago from Hendricks." Nathaniel tore open the telegram with hands that shook slightly. "Territorial records confirm Hartwell findings. Stop. Callahan land claims fraudulent. Stop. Railroad recommends alternative route. Stop. Coalition easement approved. Stop payment. 60,000 arriving December 30th. Stop. Congratulations. Stop. Hendricks." Eleanor read over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. "We won, Nathaniel, we won." "You won," he corrected. "Your research exposed Callahan's fraud. Without that, Hendricks would have approved the direct route and we'd have lost everything. We won together. Your strategy, my research, Jake's engineering analysis, Pete's organizing. That's what made the difference. Not one person, but all of us working together." Pete Lawson and Robert Brennan arrived within the hour, having received similar telegrams. The four of them stood at Nathaniel's, looking at numbers that meant survival instead of ruin. 20,000 to Nathaniel. Enough to pay off debts, rebuild from storm damage, and make it through winter with reserves intact. 15,000 each to Pete and Robert, saving their hashes from foreclosure. 10,000 to Jake Morrison for his engineering work, paid from Nathaniel's share as promised. "What about Callahan?" Pete asked. "What happens to him?" "The railroad is severing all business relationships," Nathaniel said, reading the full letter that had accompanied the telegram. "They're also referring his fraudulent land claims to territorial prosecutors. He'll likely face criminal charges for defrauding investors. Even if he avoids prison, his reputation is destroyed. No one will do business with a known fraud." "He brought it on himself," Eleanor said quietly. "He could have competed fairly. Instead, he chose intimidation and deception. That's what actually defeated him, not us. We just exposed what he'd been hiding." That night, Nathaniel called everyone together in the dining room, a space that had gone from empty to full over 3 short months. Thomas and Rose sat on one side, Eleanor on the other. Pete and his wife had joined them for dinner, along with Robert Brennan and his eldest son. The table designed for 12 finally had enough people to feel less like furniture and more like family. "I want to thank all of you," Nathaniel said, standing at the head of the table. 3 months ago, I was alone in this house, convinced that wealth was measured in bank accounts and property deeds. You've taught me differently, shown me that real wealth is measured in people willing to stand beside you, in children who make you want to be worthy of their trust, in women who see past your walls to the person underneath." He raised his glass. "To coalition, to community, to the understanding that we're stronger together than apart." They drank, and the conversation flowed easily. Stories about the storm, speculation about spring planting, plans for expanding operations now that financial crisis had been averted. Normal talk, family talk, the kind Nathaniel had thought he'd never experience again. Later, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on the porch together. The sky had cleared, revealing stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. "Spring comes in 3 months, Eleanor said. "You said you'd ask me something when the spring arrived." "I did, but I'm realizing I don't need to wait that long, because the answer has been clear since the blizzard, maybe before." "What's the question?" Nathaniel turned to face her fully. "Eleanor Hartwell, will you marry me? Not because of business arrangements or survival necessity, but because I love you. Because I want to spend my life becoming worthy of the faith you've shown in me. Because you and your children are my family now, and I want that to be permanent and official and real in every way that matters." Eleanor's breath caught. "You're sure this isn't gratitude for helping defeat Callahan?" "I've been sure since the night Thomas saved the mare. Since I watched you research land records for 2 weeks to find the evidence no one else could uncover. Since I realized that every good thing that's happened in 3 months happened because you were here making it possible." He took her hands. "I'm sure, Eleanor. more sure than I've been about anything in 10 years. Then yes, she said, smiling through tears, 1,000 times yes, because I love you too, because you've given my children a father and me a partner and all of us a home, because you're learning to be the man I always knew you could become. He kissed her then, properly, not the chaste connection of before, but something deeper, promise and passion and the recognition of two people who had found each other against impossible odds. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. When? Eleanor asked. Whenever you want. Tomorrow, next week, next month. I'll leave the planning to you. You're better with people than I am. January 15th, after the railroad payment arrives and finances are stable, after we've had time to prepare properly. I want to do this right, Nathaniel. No rushed ceremony. A real wedding that announces to everyone that we're building something permanent. January 15th it is. They stood together in the starlight, holding each other against the cold, planning a future that had seemed impossible 3 months ago. Inside the house, Thomas and Rose slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they finally had a real home, that the running was over, that they'd found a place and people worth staying for. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor planned the wedding with the same precision she brought to everything else. Martha Thornton helped with the dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream silk. Pete Lawson offered his barn for the reception, large enough to hold the entire town. Reverend Harwell agreed to perform the ceremony, pleased to finally see Nathaniel Blackwood rejoining the community he'd isolated himself from for so long. The railroad payment arrived on December 30th, exactly as promised. $20,000 that transformed Nathaniel's ledgers from catastrophic to comfortable. He paid his debts, invested in storm repairs, set aside reserves for future crises. But he also did something unprecedented. He donated $5,000 to establish a community fund for ranchers facing hardship, managed by a board that included Pete Lawson, Martha Thornton, and Eleanor herself. Why could you ever me? Eleanor asked when he showed her the paperwork. Because I remember what it felt like to be alone and desperate. Because the community stood with me when I needed them. Because some debts can't be repaid directly, only paid forward. January 15th, 1869 dawn, clear and cold. Perfect weather for a winter wedding. The church was packed beyond capacity. Everyone in Silver Creek turning out to witness something no one had thought possible. Nathaniel Blackwood, the man who'd spent 10 years building walls, voluntarily tearing them down. Thomas walked Eleanor down the aisle, his young face solemn with the importance of the role. Rose followed as flower girl, scattering dried petals saved from autumn. When Eleanor reached the altar and took Nathaniel's hands, the entire congregation could feel the weight of the moment. Reverend Harwell spoke about second chances, about redemption, about how the hardest winters make spring more precious. Then Nathaniel and Eleanor spoke their own vows, words they'd written together. Eleanor, Nathaniel began, you came to me with 17 cents and a question I couldn't answer. You asked if I wanted a wife or another winter alone. I didn't know then, but I know now I want a partner, a companion, someone who makes me better than I could ever be alone, someone who sees my flaws and loves me anyway, someone who proves every day that the best investments aren't measured in gold. I promise to honor you, protect you, learn from you, and build with you a life worthy of the faith you've shown. I promise to be the father your children deserve and the husband you need. I promise to measure wealth in love, not ledgers. This I swear before God and this community. Eleanor's voice was steady despite tears. Nathaniel, you gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. But more than that, you gave me purpose when I'd forgotten my own worth. You taught my son how to be a man. You showed my daughter what strength looks like. You proved that people can change, that walls can come down, that love isn't always loud or obvious, but sometimes grows quietly in shared work and mutual respect. She squeezed his hands. I promise to stand beside you in every fight, celebrate every victory, mourn every loss. I promise to be honest when you need truth and gentle when you need comfort. I promise to measure success in laughter and loyalty, not property and profit. This I swear before God and this community. Then by the power vested in me, Reverend Harwell said, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined, let no man separate. The kiss that followed was witnessed by 87 people, every one of them cheering. As they turned to face the congregation, Nathaniel felt the familiar weight in his vest pocket. Rose's stick figure drawing from 3 months ago, carried every day since that first week. Tonight, he would frame it and hang it in the entrance hall. The first picture on those walls in a decade. In that moment, Nathaniel Blackwood wasn't the rich, cold banker who'd foreclosed on desperate families. He was a man who'd learned what actually mattered, who'd chosen connection over isolation, who'd found family in the least expected place. The reception lasted until midnight, the barn warm with bodies and laughter and the kind of community celebration that Montana winters demanded. Eleanor danced with Nathaniel, then with Thomas, then with Pete Lawson and Robert Brennan and a dozen others. Nathaniel, who claimed he couldn't dance, managed credibly under Eleanor's patient instruction. "You're better at this than you think," she said as they waltzed inexpertly around the barn floor. "I have a good teacher and motivation to learn." "What motivation?" "Impressing my wife, making sure she doesn't regret choosing me." "Nathaniel Blackwood, I will never regret choosing you. Not in 40 years. Not in 80. Not ever." They rode home as the sun rose on January 16th, exhausted and happy. Thomas and Rose fell asleep immediately, worn out from dancing and celebration. Nathaniel and Eleanor stood together in the kitchen of the house that was now officially theirs together. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said. He retrieved a document from his office, placed it on the kitchen table. Eleanor read it slowly, her eyes widening. It was a property deed. Blackwood Ranch, 600 acres, valued at $38,000. But the ownership line had been changed. Nathaniel and Eleanor Blackwood, joint tenants with right of survivorship. "You're making me co-owner?" she whispered. "Equal partner. In everything. The ranch, the bank shares, all of it. If something happens to me, you and the children are protected. If something happens to you, I'm still bound to the promises I made." He touched her face gently. "But more than legal protection, this is recognition. You've earned this, Eleanor. Your work, your intelligence, your courage. This ranch survived because of you as much as me. You deserve your name on the deed. Thomas and Rose are also protected. I've created trust funds for both, funded from my share of the railroad payment. When Thomas turns 18, he'll have $5,000 to start his own operation or invest however he chooses. Rose gets the same at 18. Our children will never face what you faced after William died." Eleanor was crying now, overwhelmed by the practical expression of love. Not grand gestures or empty promises, but legal documents that protected her family, that acknowledged her contribution, that made their partnership real in every way that mattered. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too. Took me 35 years and near bankruptcy to figure out what love actually means. But I know now it's this: documents and commitments, shared ownership and shared risk, building something together that neither of us could build alone." They went upstairs together as the sun climbed higher, beginning their marriage the way they'd begun everything else, with honesty, practical planning, and the understanding that the best foundations are built on truth, not fantasy. Spring came 6 weeks later, early and sudden, as Montana springs often are. The snow melted in rushing rivers. Grass emerged green and new. The cattle that had survived winter began gaining weight on fresh forage. Thomas would turn 12 in July, but he'd already grown tall enough to look Nathaniel in the eye when they worked together. Rose had turned 7 in March, reading at a level far beyond her years thanks to Eleanor's patient teaching. On the first truly warm day of April, Nathaniel and Eleanor stood on the porch at sunset, watching Thomas teach Rose to rope fence posts. The girls' laughter carried across the yard, pure and bright, the sound of a child who'd forgotten what it meant to be hungry, or homeless, or afraid. "Worth it?" Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband. "Every penny, every risk, every terrifying moment when I thought we'd lose everything." He wrapped his arm around her. "You asked me once what I needed. I couldn't answer then. But I know now I needed this. Family, purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just accumulating more money." "What about Margaret?" Do you ever think about her? Sometimes, but not with anger anymore. She taught me what I didn't want. You taught me what I did. Both lessons were necessary. Eleanor smiled. Very philosophical, Mr. Blackwood. I'm learning from my wife. She's quite wise. She's quite tired. Growing a business and growing a baby is exhausting work. Nathaniel froze. Baby? Due in October, according to Dr. Sullivan's calculations. I was going to tell you at dinner, but this moment seemed better. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her arms, his face showing wonder he made no attempt to hide. October, a new baby. Our child, not yours or mine. Ours. Are you happy? I'm terrified, and happier than I knew was possible. Both at once, Owasso. They held each other as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside the house, preparations for dinner continued. Outside, their children played in the yard of their forever home. Around them, the ranch they'd fought to save thrived under their joint management. The mathematics had finally balanced, not in ledgers or bank accounts, but in something more valuable and more fragile. In family built from necessity and choice. In love earned through honesty and work. In the understanding that the richest man isn't the one with the most money, but the one with the most reasons to be grateful for each morning. Nathaniel Blackwood had spent 10 years learning that lesson the hard way, but he'd finally learned it, and in learning he'd found something worth more than all the gold in Montana. A home, a family, a future measured in laughter and loyalty instead of ledgers and loss. The price of honor, he'd discovered, wasn't poverty or sacrifice. It was simply the courage to choose people over profit, connection over isolation, love over the safety of never being hurt again. And it was worth every penny he'd never counted.